Chained Echoes is touted frequently as a love letter to classic RPGs, and has received countless praises and even comparisons to iconic titles like Chrono Trigger. Though the question becomes, as with any game that has this type of praise dumped on it, is it overhyped due to the lack of games to scratch that itch, or does it fully live up to the words echoing through the gaming community? So today we're going to look at the areas where it really does live up to that praise, as well as take a more acute look at the areas where it falls a little bit short, that, while not game-breaking, may temper your expectations when you go and pick it up. Starting out with probably the most prominent factor in most people's enjoyment of JRPGs, the story, the protagonist of Chained Echoes is Glenn. No, not the frog, but rather a red-haired kid who is a master sky armor pilot with a mercenary troop, and he serves as the fulcrum for the entire adventure. And for the non-spoiler summary, his journey follows the standard rise and fall of confidence, kingdoms, struggles with friendships, and of course otherworldly foes that desire control of the story's MacGuffin, that you would just basically expect from your standard JRPG. It is for the most part doing fine at hitting those kind of notes that you'd expect, but it does fall a bit flat at times due to either over-reliance on the tropes, or other times due to wild shifts in the character's moods that don't feel quite as fleshed out as I would hope. The main deviation from standard JRPG content, and this is only a partial deviation since other games have done it more prominently, is that it approaches much more heavy topics at times than you would actually normally see on this kind of game, and some would even have trigger warnings on the more self-aware content. Sure, there are other games that do this, but oftentimes in Chained Echoes, it feels more like a character kind of footnote or backstory motivation, rather than something the character actually experienced or are actively dealing with. So expect heavier topics, but expect them to be a bit more fleeting when mentioned. Now, for the potentially spoilery bits, which is why I included chapters in this video, we can look at how the story unfolds overall, and the pros and cons of the experience. I will still try to avoid specifics when possible, so it won't ruin the game for you if you do watch this, but you have been warned that this might skew your view of the overall playthrough. The beginning, at least after the introduction of our protagonist, some temporary characters, and the grimoire of mass destruction that serves as the story's main MacGuffin, dips towards one of the common tavern alternatives for starting a TTRPG campaign. And that is, multiple parties going after one objective that they ultimately line up their agendas and become your inseparable party. Or at least partially inseparable, though we'll see more on that later on. We of course get our journey ignited fighting, and basically revelations about characters' pasts, and objectives squared away fairly early for our first bits, and of course we encounter our roadblocks, quite literally in this case, that impair our journey. The story generally, even in the later parts, follows this usual cliche of ebbs and flows as we get closer to our objective, only to have it ripped from our hands again, after which we gain more power to try for it in the new circumstances. Even as far as eventually regaining the sky armors we were introduced to during the prelude, except now we can upgrade them, change parts, and use a plethora of more skills. And overall, this would be fine, but a few moments along the way sort of ripped me out of the scenes more than I would like, namely a tendency of the game to force much quicker transitions for characters between hopeless slumps back into "yes, I'm the hero" mode. And the characters seem to either wallow in self-doubt or be extremely overconfident, sometimes within minutes of each other in the case of the main character on multiple situations. Ignoring that tendency in the writing, most of the characters did advance just fine beyond that, with only a couple somewhat grating on me, with the most prominent one being one of the royalty in your party, yes, there's more than one, being a common offender in that it felt like the writing was attempting to paint her as more neurodivergent than the rest of the cast. I would often find her dialogue and the internal monologue it fed alongside it to be really bad representations of that, often favoring insulting rather than simply being blunt or unaware of social constructs, as you'd kind of expect from a more nuanced approach. And no, this is not part of her curse, at least not as far as the story told. The real oddity in this is that some of the other characters actually do a kind of minor neurodivergent behavior, and do it a bit more accurately, but it often feels much less intentional than with her specifically. And outside of certain circumstances, most of the other characters either did approach things properly, or were more sub-note characters that only got occasional mentions, or were even comedy focused, such as your food driven blue mage. There's also a martial artist character that was kind of a sub-note, and some of the other late game characters. Though one of them that you get as a side quest does actually have some interesting development that was a fairly nice payoff for doing the side quests. How all this plays into the story means that while the overarching story is good enough, probably B+ quality, it hits moments where it feels stilted, especially in the mid to late game where you reach the point of having the most stuff being juggled in the air that typically occurs in this type of game, since you're triggering far more of the types of character building, plot advancement, and historical content, and these issues fell off a bit as we approach the actual proper end. So I'd say the start was good, but a little slow. The middle was content dense, but with some stilted moments, and the end was rewarding enough. Speaking of the end though, and trying not to spoil it, I'll say that the type of twist present was somewhat expected. However, the positioning of the characters in it was less predictable to an extent, which works out fine for me. I do not mind a cliche ending if it's well done, and this one was fairly well done for a JRPG of its budget and scale. And playing through a 30 to 40 hour game, for a casual playthrough at least, did not feel like it was a waste of time for the payoff. Now, while the story was a solid B+, the gameplay and progression are a bit more of a mixed bag, with some exceptionally good aspects that I wish more games would do, a few that just barely missed the mark, and then a few that were downright annoying. This is mostly due to the fact that I think for the game format, there's just a few too many subsystems to play around with, which sadly does happen a lot with single dev games or even small team games. Now, starting out with some of the basic, really good things it does, many of which are just simple quality of life features, such as fast travel through a crystal system, minimizing the walk of shame annoyance by allowing basic retries on failed battles, you have auto healing after battle so you don't have to use a ton of resources or do a lot of menuing for that, and various hint systems you can get up and going just based on growing your base feature that you get a little ways into the game. And ranging on telling you how many chests, hidden treasures, and secret passages in the area are some of these features, to characters that will passively farm crafting materials while you play, just based on how long you play. And there's even ones that will provide you hints on where to find these new characters for your base. This is all really handy, and it respects the player's time nicely, which is always a plus in any game, especially one with this one's scope. The combat system is also fairly well done, with a lot of interesting tools integrated into it, such as character swapping, allowing more diverse strategies, letting you essentially bring 8 of the 12 potential characters into any given battle. It also introduces an overdrive system where different types of actions raise or lower the bar, that whenever you get to the overdrive section itself increases your damage output, while when you go into the red it makes you take more damage as well, resulting in a sort of tug of war with your abilities depending on what you're facing. The only drawback of these features is I didn't really feel the need to worry about them on either of my playthroughs. Though maybe they'd be more important if you crank the difficulty modifiers up to max, which makes it tighten the overdrive bar, making that more difficult, makes enemies hit harder and take more hits to kill, and makes them much more aggressive towards your characters. Though even then, with stall tactics and high agility, I think you'd be fine. So basically, they're cool ideas and useful if you want to use them, but not necessary for progress. And this is sort of a common thread in some of the various character mechanics in the game. Probably one of the best examples is the class emblem system, which is a cool idea and one that you can use to give your characters abilities they otherwise would not have, such as dipping into different elements of damage to exploit weaknesses, healing on an attack character, or even some limited summoning effects, which are basically just passive damage adders for the battle. Heck, there's even ways to have multiple characters stealing items, though that one is not extremely useful since one of your best damage dealers is also the thief that can get a 100% steal rate, while the emblem keeps a failure chance at kind of an even max level. The main thing I found myself doing on the rare case I wanted an ability from a class emblem was simply using the spare skill points you gather from battles to just immediately max out the emblem skill that I wanted so I could use it even after unequipping the emblem. That way I could maintain the stat boost from the class emblem that I actually wanted to fit my build, rather than the one using the weaker stat boost from that I wanted a skill from. This isn't helped by the fact that about a third of the emblems aren't even able to be obtained until near the end of the game, and those aren't very impressive compared to the ones you got earlier. And you'll find with your limited active skill slots, the appeal of getting weaker versions of other character skills gets a bit less appealing outside of healing and summoning, especially since character stats impact the effectiveness of these abilities. So your physical attacker, he won't be doing good at dealing magic damage, for example, even if you master it. And a little bit of an odd side note on the summons here, I'm not sure whether it's intentional or just something to do with the programming. There is a weird quirk where the character with a companion can't actually summon anything in battle, since I do actually wager in the code, the dog and the summon occupy the same place in the code. So it did feel weird to have her precluded from using one of the class emblem's abilities, but I can kind of understand where it's coming from. Now, on the subject of skills, you actually obtain them from the game's leveling system, which is more a milestone system through the use of Grimoire Shards, that you basically get by completing boss battles, side quests, and even stuff like the reward board that gives you bonuses for completing various tasks in various zones. There really is not a way to grind these, but using them will unlock stat upgrades as well as new skills and passive abilities you could equip, with tiered requirements getting basically the better abilities. So you can't get, like, say, an endgame ability with your first shard, since you have to use a certain number of shards to unlock a given tier. I'm actually fine with the milestone systems, and it's what I use in tabletop games, though it does mean that if you're having trouble with a section, you will need to just adjust the difficulty in the game, which thankfully you can do on the fly, rather than use the option to level up past it like you would in other RPGs. And while I did not personally encounter any enemy roadblocks that were impassable to me, if you do run into them, the milestone system pretty much will guarantee you need to get good, since you can only do so much on the reward board at specific stages to unlock more Grimoire Shards. You won't be getting a lot more levels than intended. Now, at a certain point, you'll also get access to a system outside of these Grimoire Shards, and that is actually a bit more grindable, but is only available for certain sections of the game. And that's Sky Armor. Sky Armor serves as both a traversal tool thanks to the flight ability on them to otherwise unreachable areas, but they also serve as a combat tool to deal with enemies you cannot fight in the flesh. And how these Sky Armors level up is, well, grinding of a sort. Though even without the grinding, I was able to reach max level in all weapons on all Sky Armors by the end of the game. Now, it is worth noting, both before you get flight and after you get flight from these guys, you will encounter invisible walls of, that is the wrong way, so this flight does not unlock everything in the game. But it does give you access to a lot more very quickly. In terms of the skills though, the way it functions through your Sky Armors is to have their own sets of equipment. And yes, you can even change the shell and the paint job to make it look how you want. And they'll have high life, high damage, etc. to deal with the larger enemies. Though to get stronger, you'll need to find better versions of each weapon, as well as spend time using each weapon. Since as you level your ability with weapons, you can get permanent stat buffs that last whether you have it equipped or not, as well as abilities you can use, though only with that base weapon. The starting loadout is fine for beating the game, though I found that with the exception of certain enemy immunities, you can pretty much just go with any combination you want of melee and ranged weapons, though I found I usually fell back on elemental and healing secondaries more than any of the others. And also, in some cases, you can actually engage enemies that are intended for the armor with your normal fleshy characters, but since you often have 1/10 or even 1/20th of the life of the armors, most of these bigger enemies will one-shot your normal party. So outside of going for certain achievements for the reward board or possibly specific canning or theft functions, I would probably avoid it. And while cool, I often felt, with a few exceptions, that the armor sections felt more shoehorned in to justify their presence, rather than something that was really being used to build more diversity, since outside of the gear system to control and balance their unique overdrive bar, the mechanics just felt like simplified versions of normal combat, but with bigger numbers. Now, before we get into the last big thing in game mechanics, items, there's one last somewhat nitpicky thing about the combat that felt a little off to me, and that is the enemy behavior and abilities. Namely, early on, as you'd expect, enemies are mostly just simple slugfests, and as you go through, you'll have peaks and valleys in difficulty that you can kind of counter with elemental weaknesses and the like. Some a bit more harsh than others, but never a massive problem unless you go out of your way to have a fight that you shouldn't be at right now. But towards the very end of the game, enemies went from barely using status effects, much less impactful ones, to having an increased frequency of auto-kill, timed kill, or death-for-death effects that seemed a bit out of place. While handy for special bosses, I often find these effects in common enemies or as frequent fallback for artificial difficulty to be a bit off-putting, and Chained Echoes definitely rode that line hard at times. Not enough to be egregious or harm the game seriously, but definitely enough to be noticed and mildly annoying. Especially since there's very few counters to it short of just burning resurrection items or bringing a specific character along with the re-raise spell. But overall, outside of that weirdness at the end, the enemy balance was fairly enjoyable, though I do wish they would have used more debuffs throughout the game to add more flavor to various enemy types, because they were enjoyably varied in, like, visuals, but they did lack tactile differences between many enemies outside of basic damage amounts and AoE versus single target. Now, all that said, to support combat, you do need items. The consumables are fine, your standard fare in fact, with status effect cures, life restoration, revival, etc. And you don't need to overhoard them since there is that end of battle healing we mentioned earlier. So they serve more the role of emergency patch-up in battle quite well. The real depth though comes in the realm of equipable items for your characters, and some side mechanics to gathering various resources and base items in the form of deals and crystals. The deal system is an interesting one if fairly simple, in that it uses what you sell to fuel what special deals the merchants will offer you. So if you sell a bunch of junk item A, you'll get a deal associated with that. And if you sell the right variety of these items, you'll unlock more deals and get more crafting materials, base items, consumables, etc. from it for spending just small amounts of money. And you can use those items to do crafting in the game, which is basically upgrading your weapons and armors to do more damage or make you more durable, and of course have more crystal slots, which we'll get to in a minute since crystals are a whole big discussion point. Now you can do this upgrading on any weapon or armor you use, and generally, at least until you get to the end game, the materials you'll need will be fairly common drops from enemies, and they'll often drop alongside the junk items you use to unlock various deals. Now early on, your next step in weapons and armor will be stronger than even fully upgraded versions of the previous tier. But as you near the end, upgraded versions will be stronger than base versions of the next tier. So if you want to optimize your damage, you'll often be holding onto your new weapon or armor until you can get to a crafting anvil, so you can upgrade it to surpass your old one. And while both of these systems are fine, they do land on a gripe I have with most modern crafting systems: the use of fluff items as materials. Basically, you have a ton of items dropping that do absolutely nothing and add artificial complexity. I would have loved to see it instead use natural items that have double use, say an oil that you use for an upgrade, but it could also be used to blind an enemy, for example. As this has always felt like the decisions have more weight whenever you do use them, where in junk systems, there's really no decision, you're just grinding for more bunny tail B until the upgrade is done. Then, after that, if you fight those enemies again, you're just accumulating masses of useless bunny tail B when the craft is done is no longer needed. This is one thing I poke at in a lot of games, and I wish we did better on, but it might not bother you as much as it does me. Now, the other important thing for gear is the crystal system, a system I avoided like the plague because of all the menuing, at least until I got warnings that my crystal inventory was full from just not using it. And then I just combined them all and put them in my weapons and armor at the end of the game. Now, does the system serve a function? Yeah, it adds status effects, stat boosts, resist, drop improvements, etc. to all of your gear, and it is usable super early in the game. It is handy if you want to spend the time learning about it and doing all the menuing for it, but for me it was just too clunky to engage with, and I feel a simplified system that just had the basic gem functions and sockets would have been better overall. That said, the way it works though is pretty much the reason why I avoided it. First, you have two types of crystals. You have base crystals, which can be just most crystals with a level of purity above 0, and fused crystals, which can be any non-manufactured crystal, which is a crystal you crafted. These are combined to create a new crystal of the same type, but with their levels added up, and it will average the size of the two, so you'll often end up with a lot of 2-socket crystals, at least I did, as you get higher level stuff. Now, to be put into an item, the crystal has to be at least rank 3, so they did thankfully include a system that auto-merges all level 1 and level 2 crystals, but to get the most out of a crystal, you want to be looking for level 5 or 10 crystals, since these are the milestones that make their effects more potent. Needless to say, this all gets convoluted extremely quickly whenever you take into account the variety of crystals as well. Sure, you can only combine an attack up with an attack up, but pretty much every passive ability on your character can be mirrored through crystals, so it gets to be a massive list of dig through and scrolling just to get the crafting done, especially if you wait until the end game to do it like I did. Though, all that said, the overall gameplay, and at least at the core, did feel fine. The combat is predictable on the map, the enemies for the most part were fairly balanced outside of a few specific spikes I ran into, and the mechanics you absolutely have to engage with work well, and they are sufficient for beating the game. As most of the warts are basically just in the tacked on content or the side content that's optional. Though I do wish I would have noticed that you could fast forward the speed of battles prior to the end of my second playthrough for capturing B-roll. That probably would have saved me a lot of time. Though there is one game feature, mechanic, glitch, maybe? I'm not sure what to call it here, that did not save me time, and that was an oddity of party composition that seemed to occur after major story events or situations where characters either temporarily left or even just cutscenes, or joined the party, and that is my party layout would get scrambled. In one instance, I fixed it, and it got scrambled again less than 10 minutes later by yet another story event. Which makes me wish there was an auto set for your kind of setup you could create a party layout for just for quick shifting to it. And if there is such a feature, I didn't see it on any of my playthroughs, so maybe tell me in the comments. It's a small gripe, but one that really started to itch at my mind, especially on the second round of the game, because I had already been through it once, and it did frustrate me enough to swear on that second playthrough. Not angrily, mind you, but definitely mildly annoyed. Overall, warts and all, I still did enjoy the game. I would definitely play it again if there was an interest in streaming it, and I would not feel like I was wasting time because I had fun with it. Now that said, it is definitely overhyped from my perspective as well. This is a good game, this is an enjoyable game, and it wholly deserves a place in the libraries of indie RPG cult classics. Though does it reach the status of games like Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, Phantasy Star 4, etc. that it's compared to? Not quite, but close enough to leave me happy to have played it, and close enough for me to say spending a couple weekends going through it will generally not be a waste of time if you enjoy the genre, and it absolutely does beat out many of the modern alternatives. And if you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate the usual random YouTube garbage, like, subscribe, etc., since it does really help out the channel and the video. But most importantly, be sure to keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye.